Rights and Labor, who will also make a brief statement and stay to take more of your questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Secretary Blinken.
Ed, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. It's nice to be mask to mask, or at least face to mask in this case. So I want to speak to the report, and then, as Ned said, we'll try and take a couple of questions. I have the honor today of joining our Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Lisa Peterson, in presenting the 45th Annual Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, which offer a comprehensive review of human rights in nearly 200 countries and territories. I very much want to thank you, Lisa, and thank the many folks at the Department here in Washington, but also around the world, in our embassies, in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, who researched, drafted, and edited these reports. They brought not only their expert knowledge of the issues, but also a commitment to rigorously document the facts. I also want to thank human rights defenders, journalists, and researchers whose efforts informed these reports. They work every day to advance human dignity, often, as you all know, at great risk to themselves and to their loved ones. We are humbled by their dedication and by their bravery. President Biden is committed to putting human rights back at the center of American foreign policy, and that's a commitment that I and the entire Department of State take very seriously. We will bring to bear all the tools of our diplomacy to defend human rights and hold accountable perpetrators of abuse. The reports we're releasing today are just one way to do that. One of the core principles of human rights is that they are universal. All people are entitled to these rights, no matter where they're born, what they believe, whom they love, or any other characteristic. Human rights are also co-equal. There is no hierarchy that makes some rights more important than others. Past unbalanced statements that suggest such a hierarchy, including those offered by a recently disbanded State Department Advisory Committee, do not represent a guiding document for this administration. At my confirmation hearing, I promised that the Biden-Harris administration would repudiate those unbalanced views. We do so decisively today. Human rights are also interdependent. If you can't assemble peacefully, how can you organize a union or an opposition party or exercise your freedom of religion or belief? If you're denied equal access to a job or an education because of the color of your skin or your gender identity, how can you attain health and well-being for yourself and your family? The report we're releasing today shows that the trend lines on human rights continue to move in the wrong direction. We see evidence that in every region of the world, this is happening. We see it in the genocide being committed against the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. The attacks on and the imprisonment of opposition politicians, anti-corruption activists, independent journalists in places like Russia, Uganda, Venezuela. We see it in the arbitrary arrests, beatings, and other violence against protesters in Belarus, and in the violations and abuses inflicted on the people of Yemen by the parties in that country's conflict. We see it in the killings, sexual assaults, and other atrocities credibly reported in Ethiopia's Tigray region, and in the executions, forced disappearances, and tortures committed by the Syrian regime, as well as its ongoing attacks on schools, on markets, on hospitals. The latest of those attacks occurred just last week, when the Syrian regime killed 7 people, including 2 children, cousins, aged 10 and 12 years old, in a strike on the Al-Atarab hospital in western Aleppo. We also see it in the ways authoritarian governments are using and exporting new technologies to surveil and harass citizens and spread disinformation at home and abroad. We see it in what's happening in Burma. The events since the military coup occurred after this year's report was finished, but we must highlight them. Nonviolent protesters in Burma have been killed, beaten, imprisoned, including on Saturday, when more than 100 people were reportedly killed by the military. Many of those killed were protesting on Armed Forces Day, others simply bystanders. The military said in advance that they might shoot protesters in the back or the head, and they've made good on that threat. Among those reportedly killed, 4 children, the youngest, a 5-year-old boy. We condemn these and other widespread violations by Burma's security forces in the strongest terms. And we continue to call on the military regime to release all those people who've been unjustly detained, stop its attacks on civil society members, journalists, labor unionists, halt the killings by its security forces, and return to power the democratically elected government. The United States is committed to working with its allies and partners to hold the perpetrators of these abhorrent acts accountable. All of these alarming trend lines are being worsened by COVID-19, which autocratic governments have used as a pretext to target their critics and further repress human rights. Plus, COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted the individuals and groups in our societies who are already subject to abuse, to discrimination, to marginalization before the pandemic, such as racial and ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI persons. Women and girls have also endured greater gender-based violence during lockdowns and face more obstacles to seeking help. Now, some have argued that it's not worth it for the United States to speak up forcefully for human rights, or that we should highlight abuse only in select countries and only in a way that directly advances our national interests. I believe those people miss the point. Standing up for human rights everywhere is in America's interests, and the Biden-Harris administration will stand against human rights abuses wherever they occur, regardless of whether the perpetrators are adversaries or partners. Countries where dissent is welcomed, where corrupt and abusive officials are punished, where labor laws are respected, where people of all backgrounds have equal access and opportunities, those countries are more likely to be peaceful, prosperous, stable. They're less likely to fall into conflict. They're more likely to have growing economies and be markets for our own goods and services. And governments that respect human rights are more likely to support the rules-based international order that the United States and our allies have built and invested in for decades and decades. Look at the countries that run roughshod over the rights of their people. They are almost always the same countries that flout internationally accepted rules beyond their borders, whether that's by lopping off the territory of other countries, launching cyber attacks, harassing dissidents, spreading disinformation, or breaking trade rules. In addition to all of these reasons, there's a simpler one. Standing for people's freedom and dignity honors America's most sacred values. At our best, we stand for freedom and justice for all, not just here at home, but around the world. We will hear from some countries, as we do every year, that we have no right to criticize them because we have our own challenges to deal with. Well, we know we have work to do at home. That includes addressing profound inequities, including systemic racism. We don't pretend these problems don't exist or try to sweep them under the rug. We don't ignore them. We deal with them in the daylight with full transparency. And in fact, that's exactly what separates our democracy from autocracies, our ability and willingness to confront our own shortcomings out in the open, to pursue that more perfect union. And the way we confront our challenges at home will give us greater legitimacy in advocating for human rights abroad. It's what President Biden means when he says we must lead by the power of our example. These annual human rights reports are important, but of course, they're not enough. We will use a broad range of other tools to stop abuses and hold perpetrators to account. One way to do that is by working with the United States Congress, which has passed laws providing new authorities to sanction human rights violators, things like the Global Magnitsky Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, other pieces of important legislation, and continues to demonstrate a bipartisan commitment to promoting human rights. We'll continue to look for innovative ways to partner with Congress to shine a light on abuses and hold perpetrators to account. Another way is by imposing consequences through economic sanctions and visa restrictions, as the United States did recently, in unity with Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, on individuals engaged in atrocities being committed against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And we will find ways to incentivize countries to take positive steps toward respecting human rights, such as through trade benefits and development aid. The Khashoggi ban, which we created after the period covered by this year's human rights reports, gives us an additional tool to hold accountable officials who harm journalists, activists, or other perceived dissidents by revoking or restricting visas to them or their family members. While this policy bears Jamal Khashoggi's name, and we first applied it to 76 individuals from Saudi Arabia for their appalling actions targeting perceived dissidents abroad, including the killing of Mr. Khashoggi, we'll apply the ban to officials from any country that targets dissidents beyond its borders. As we take these steps, we recognize that America is always more effective when we work with allies and partners. I delivered that message in recent visits with allies and partners in Asia, Europe, and North America, and in my virtual visit yesterday to the United Nations. We will engage in multilateral institutions, even flawed ones, like the UN Human Rights Council, because we can do much more to move them in the right direction when we have a seat at the table instead of staying outside of the room. And because in our absence, we have seen how autocratic governments use these institutions to undercut human rights. The Biden-Harris administration will also redouble our efforts to support journalists, human rights defenders, anti-corruption activists, labor union organizers, and other advocates around the world who put everything on the line to defend human rights. When these people come under attack, they often look to the United States to speak up on their behalf. Too often in recent years, these defenders heard only silence from us. President Biden says that America is back. We are back for those brave advocates as well. We will not be silent. A final note on an important topic. For many years, our human rights reports contained a section on reproductive health, including information about maternal mortality, discrimination against women in accessing sexual and reproductive health care, and government policies about access to contraception and skilled health care during pregnancy and childbirth. These topics were removed from the country reports by the previous administration, so they're not part of the reports released today, which cover the year 2020. I've asked our team to release an addendum for each country report later this year that will cover these issues. And we're restoring the practice of documenting these rights in 2021 and in future years. It's one of many steps, along with revoking the Mexico City policy, withdrawing from the Geneva Consensus Declaration, resuming support for the United Nations Population Fund, that we're taking to promote women's health and equity at home and abroad. Because women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, are human rights. Thank you very much, and happy to take a question.
Andrea, go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, in speaking out against human rights in China and Russia in particular, are you creating a blowback, a reaction, in that you're creating an alliance of autocracies, really, against us, and criticism from both of those countries in the last week that we are bullying them? How do you counteract that and make your criticism more effective, especially in the context of them, neither of them, to our knowledge, doing anything to help you regarding Burma or Myanmar and the atrocities there?
Andrew, I'd say a couple of things to that. First, and more generically, whether it's China, Russia, or anyone else, we're not standing against any of those countries. We're not trying to, for example, contain China or keep it down. What we are about is standing up for basic principles, basic rights, and a rules-based international order that has served us and countries around the world very, very well. And when any country, in whatever way, seeks to undermine those rights or undermine that order, yes, we will stand and speak out forcefully about it. And that's what is going on. I think we're seeing as well that when we're doing that, we are much more effective when we are speaking out and working with other like-minded countries. And I think what you've witnessed in recent weeks, particularly with regard to the response, the international response to the abuses being committed against Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example, the quashing of democracy in Hong Kong, as well as numerous actions taken by Russia that, again, are fundamentally attacks on the international rules-based order. You're seeing country after country speak out in unison and often in a coordinated fashion. We've spoken out in conjunction and coordination with the European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, many allies and partners in Asia, and the power of countries speaking out together, I think, will be increasingly evident. So, we've seen some responses from, for example, the government in Beijing to some of the actions taken by countries in Europe. I suspect that is only going to redouble the concerns and the focus that other countries give to the actions that the government in Beijing has taken in abuse of human rights. I think we're already seeing that.
Secretary has time for a final question. Simon?
Thank you. You mentioned the different tools that you have at your disposal to address these issues. Obviously, the issue and the situation in Burma or Myanmar has happened since this report was written, but it offers a live case where human rights are being suppressed day by day on the ground. And we've seen from the US a kind of escalation of sanctions, week by week, more sanctions, but the generals in the country are pushing on with their course. They're not changing course. The death toll is getting more and more. What more do you have at your disposal to try to actually, get them to listen when it seems like they are completely unresponsive to everything you've done so far?
So I'd say a few things about that. First, the actions that we've seen by the Burmese military in terms of its attacks on civilians are reprehensible. And we witnessed just this past weekend, as I noted earlier, an attack that killed about 100 civilians. Some people simply caught in the crossfire, others just expressing peacefully their views. And this follows a series of other attacks, and indeed increasingly disturbing and even horrifying violence. One thing is clear: it's that the people of Burma are speaking clearly. They don't want to live under military rule. And that is evident from what we're seeing and hearing and witnessing every single day in Burma. So we've taken a number of actions, as you note. Of course, we and others have spoken out very forcefully against the violence being perpetrated by the military regime. Beyond that, we've taken specific action with regard to those responsible for the coup and enterprises that support them, including designations under various sanctions laws. We've also worked closely with other countries to speak out in unison. There are, I think, other things that countries should be looking at. For example, some countries and some companies in various parts of the world have significant investments in enterprises that support the Burmese military. They should be looking at those investments and reconsidering them as a means of denying the military the financial support it needs to sustain itself against the will of the people. But I think you can expect us to continue to speak out strongly and to work with close allies and partners, including the ASEAN countries, in strong opposition to the actions that the coup regime is taking in Burma. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon. We submitted to the U.S. Congress earlier today the country reports on human rights practices for the 45th year. I think that number demonstrates, as well as anything, the depth of the U.S. interest in and dedication to the promotion of human rights. And as the Secretary said, it is as strong a dedication as ever. Our aim is always to identify human rights challenges and use our voice and our position on the world stage to draw attention to abuses of human rights, no matter where or when they occur. And to make progress in advancing these human rights, you need facts. That's why each year the U.S. government issues the country reports on human rights practices, which address, as required by U.S. law, the status of internationally recognized human rights in all countries that are members of the United Nations. These reports provide an objective record of whether human rights and freedoms are being protected, both by law and in practice, around the world. The reports are prepared by U.S. diplomatic missions that collect, analyze, and synthesize information from a variety of sources. The country reports do not reach legal conclusions, rank countries, or draw comparisons across them. They do not attempt to catalog every human rights incident, nor are these reports an effort by the U.S. government to judge others. Instead, they are factual in nature. Publicizing facts and verifiable information can encourage governments to change course and seek to end human rights abuses. At the conclusion of this press briefing, the 2020 Country Reports on Human Rights Practices will be available to the public on the State Department website at www.state.gov. Thank you for being here today, and I am happy to take your questions.
Please.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up a little bit on China and the situation in Xinjiang. There's a determination that this is a genocide ongoing. When you say genocide, it's supposed to trigger whatever it takes from a power like the U.S. to stop it, to abide to the Never Again pledge. But the sanctions imposed so far seems a little bit low-key with regard to these targets. Do you feel that the U.S. is currently doing whatever it takes to stop a genocide in Xinjiang, and what needs to be done to do that? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the U.S. has already deployed a number of tools in response to the genocide determination. We have been clear that crimes against humanity and genocide have taken place and are continuing to be inflicted on Uyghurs, crimes against humanity against other ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang. Obviously, we can't ignore this, and we must meet such actions with serious consequences. We have deployed sanctions, and we have taken sanction actions in unity with the United Kingdom and Canada, which announced similar tranches of sanctions under their respective authorities. Also in parallel with the European Union, which undertook a broader global human rights action. This united response sends a strong signal to those who violate and abuse human rights that such actions will not be tolerated. Even prior to the determination that genocide had taken place, we had been communicating with businesses working in China, or businesses contemplating working in China. We issued a business advisory back in July of 2020. We did this in conjunction with the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Commerce, and Department of Homeland Security. cautioning businesses about the economic, legal, and reputational risks of supply chain links to entities that engage in human rights abuses, including forced labor in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China. Later on in September of 2020, the State Department published human rights due diligence guidance for transactions with foreign governments involving products or services with surveillance capabilities. It provides practical and accessible human rights guidance to U.S. businesses seeking to prevent their products or services with surveillance capabilities from being misused.
Thank
you.
Yes, the former administration nexted the designation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights as occupied territory. This year's report seems to continue the tradition. Does that mean that you are fine with this non-designation designation? How do you designate the West Bank? Thank you.
So, as we stated in previous year, we retitled this human rights report to refer to the commonly used geographic names of the area the report covers, which are Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. That's in line with our practices generally. We also believe it is clearer and more useful for readers seeking information on human rights in those specific areas. The title of the report was updated to reflect current practices in the department and to be clearer and more useful to readers and researchers.
So what is the West Bank? I mean, is it not occupied? Is it occupied? Are you fine with this new reality?
So language in this report is not meant to convey a position on any final status issues to be negotiated between the parties to the conflict, including the specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem or the borders between Israel and any future Palestinian state.
Please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mohammed Al Ahmed with Al Jazeera Arabic. The United States government was among 31 signatories of the joint statement of the Human Rights Council, which called on Egypt to lift its curb on the freedoms of expression and assembly. How are you planning, based on that joint statement and on today's report, how are you planning to build on that to pressure Egypt to improve its human rights record? Thank you.
President Biden has made clear that human rights will be at the center of our foreign policy, and that includes with Egypt. That was part of the driver for the United States joining on to the joint statement at the Human Rights Council, calling upon Egypt to improve its human rights record and emphasizing the fundamental importance of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and the need to respect a robust civil society. We continue to raise human rights concerns with officials in the government of Egypt. We also continue to support civil society to the extent possible. As the Secretary told Foreign Minister Shukri, human rights will be at the center of our relations with Egypt, and we look forward to strengthening our historic partnership and ensuring respect for democracy and human rights.
Yes, Kat.
Thanks for doing this. I want to ask a quick question about the Secretary's remarks with regard to the reproductive health section. And he said that there will be reports on that later in the year because they weren't included in the report. But I'm just curious, does the State Department have a determination as to what the impact was of not having these sections in the report over the last few years on reproductive health globally?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure that we have an immediate answer for that. I think that is something worth looking into. I think you will see a fair bit of research and study going into the impact on sexual and reproductive health rights in the context of COVID-19. I think we as a bureau, if we find the means to do so, may need to take a look at that question of, was there an impact by not having this reflected in the human rights reports?
Yeah, hi, it's Ganroor with Al Hurra Television. In putting the human rights in the center of the foreign policy, what will change in your dealing in the country, with other countries, especially with the Middle East countries?
There will be a shift, I think, in focus. We have long raised human rights issues, but this administration has been more forward-leaning, and I think that changes the degree and the centrality to which we consider this issue as we are considering the whole universe of a relationship.
Take a couple final questions. Yes.
Hi, I have two questions, one on North Korea and one on South Korea. As this administration is dealing with North Korea's nuclear issue, I'd like to know whether this North Korean human rights situation is going to be handled separately or as part of entire North Korean issues. Some human rights experts say that North Korea's human rights issue sometimes sacrifice or being used as tools for negotiation with North Korea. So how are you going to address this North Korean human rights issue? My second question on South Korea. South Korea last year passed a law banning leaflet sending activities into North Korea. So mostly done by North Korean defectors living in South Korea. And this law went into effect today. So what's your view on this? Any concerns? And do you support these defectors' effort providing like outside information into North Korea?
So on your first question, we do remain deeply concerned by North Korea's egregious human rights record, which remains among the worst in the world. The State Department, together with the interagency, is currently undergoing a North Korea policy review process, and human rights will remain an indispensable component of our overall policy towards the North Korean government. We will continue to hold the North Korean government accountable for its egregious human rights violations. In terms of the anti-leaflet bill, increasing the free flow of information into North Korea is a U.S. priority. The dissemination of information is critical for North Koreans to access fact-based information not controlled by the North Korean regime. As a global policy, we advocate for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And with regard to the DPRK, we continue to campaign for the free flow of information into the DPRK. We continue to work with our partners in the NGO community and in other countries to promote North Koreans' access to information.
Cool.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the question of China. Chinese officials have stated explicitly in recent days that the U.S. conception of human rights is not normative. And they contend that their own human rights policies are anchored in UN law. So it seems that the two of these permanent members of the Security Council disagree about the bedrock principles or basic law, if you will, of the multilateral system. So I wonder, what are the ramifications of this dispute for multilateral approaches to human rights issues? And then bearing in mind the sanctions over the weekend of Gail Manchin and Tony Perkins at the International Religious Freedom Commission, I wonder, how much do you see religious freedom questions as a predictor of a government's policies on human rights issues generally? How much does that organize some of these controversies?
I will underscore that our approach on human rights and our approach to the human rights reports is grounded in the United Nations documents. That has been our guiding set of documents from the inception of the reports. So whatever China may say about our approach, it is based in those founding UN principles and guiding UN documents. In terms of religious freedom issues, we are deeply concerned by questions around religious freedom worldwide. Religious freedom has long been part of the State Department's activities, and there is a separate standalone report on international religious freedom. Certainly, you can look at plenty of examples and see where governments who have gone down a wrong road on religious freedom subsequently go down a wrong road on other issues. I think we need to be concerned about religious freedom as an issue on its own and potentially look at the larger consequences that may go along with those concerns.
Thank you very much. We'll have an opportunity to hear more from the Acting Assistant Secretary today at 4 o'clock for the briefing call. We hope many of you can join then. Thank you.
Thank you.